It was an ordinary town, in an ordinary part of the world. Yet something strange was brewing in Ravenwood, a quiet town shrouded by a never-ending fog. The kind of town where people looked the other way, where history was buried in stories whispered in hushed tones. At the center of the town, nestled between the old bakery and the florist, was a small, unassuming shop. Curiosities and oddities. From the outside, it appeared to be just another antique store, full of relics and forgotten treasures. But if you dared step inside, you would feel the air grow heavy, thick with a sense of something watching you, something waiting. It was in this very shop that the doll waited. The doll who waited for midnight. No one knew exactly when the doll arrived, but she had been there as long as anyone could remember. She was a porcelain figure, dressed in an old-fashioned, faded gown, with a small, cracked smile and hollow eyes that gleamed in the dim light of the shop. Every night, as the clock struck 12, people claimed they could hear whispers coming from the corner where the doll sat. And though no one dared to touch her, the shopkeeper, an old woman with eyes too bright for her age, always insisted that the doll be left alone. Don't disturb her, she would warn the curious. She waits. She always waits. But then came Emily, a young woman with a passion for uncovering the town's darkest secrets. She had heard the whispers, and like so many others, she was drawn to the mystery. She entered Curiosities and Oddities one autumn evening, her breath forming little clouds in the cold, damp air. She had no idea what waited for her inside. The door creaked as it opened, sending a chill through the shop. The dim lights flickered as she stepped in, and for a moment, the world outside felt far away, replaced by the suffocating stillness of the antique-filled room. In the corner, under a dusty veil, was a doll. Emily had heard the stories of how the doll would wait for midnight, but she hadn't truly believed them. As she stepped closer, she saw her reflection in the doll's glassy eyes. It was as though the doll was studying her, and though Emily's heart began to race, she couldn't stop herself from reaching out. Her fingers brushed the doll's cool porcelain, and the second she made contact, something in the room shifted. The temperature dropped. The lights flickered out, leaving them in near darkness. Emily's breath caught in her throat. She knew she had done something terrible. The air grew thick, and the sound of the ticking clock grew louder, almost deafening. Then, the whispers began. Soft, faint, and unintelligible at first, but slowly they grew clearer. Finally, you're here. Emily pulled her hand back, but it was too late. She could feel the air around her change, tightening like a vice. The whispers now filled her ears, repeating her name over and over. She tried to move, but her legs wouldn't respond. Her body felt frozen, as if it was no longer her own. Emily, you're just in time. A cold gust of wind swept through the shop, extinguishing what little light remained. Emily could no longer see the doll, but she could feel it, its presence. In the darkness, she could sense the doll's eyes fixed on her, waiting. Then the clock struck 12. The shop seemed to come alive. The floor creaked. The walls groaned, and the doll's voice, soft and chilling, whispered in her ear, I've waited so long for you. Midnight is when it happens. Her heart pounded in her chest. She could hear the doll's laugh, a high-pitched, crackling sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Emily struggled to move, but her limbs were like stone, bound by something unseen. Do you know why I wait? The doll's voice asked, its tone sweet, yet sinister. I wait for the one who will finally free me. Then, with a sudden jolt, Emily's vision returned. She found herself standing before the doll once again, but this time, it wasn't where it had been before. The doll was standing in front of her, alive, its eyes glowing red, its cracked smile twisted into something far more sinister. She wanted to scream, but her voice was lost in the silence that had overtaken the room. The doll raised its porcelain hand, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Then, with unnatural speed, it lunged forward, gripping Emily's wrist with fingers that felt like ice. You're too late, the doll whispered, its voice now a low, guttural sound. I've waited for you for so long." The room seemed to close in around her. The walls pressed against her, and the whispers grew louder until they were deafening. The doll's laughter echoed in her ears, and as the clock struck 1, Emily felt her soul being pulled into the doll's body, her very essence consumed by its dark, unrelenting hunger. As the clock ticked on, the doll was no longer just a doll. It was alive, living, breathing, and waiting for the next midnight, for the next soul to claim. And as for Emily, no one ever saw her again. The shopkeeper would later say she was never meant to touch the doll. But the town would never be the same. If you want more terrifying tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe to Terrifying Tales of America. There are more dark stories lurking in the corners of the world, and they may just be waiting for you. Emily's body felt weightless, as if she were suspended in an endless void. The sound of her pulse was the only thing she could hear. Thump, thump, thump. Louder, faster. Her eyes fluttered open, but all she could see was the faint, red glow of the doll's eyes. The clock still ticked relentlessly, its rhythm matching the frantic beating of her heart. Her throat felt tight, and for a moment, she thought she might suffocate in the darkness. She wanted to scream, to cry out for help, but her mouth wouldn't obey her. There was a sickening, creeping sensation that her body was no longer hers, as if something had taken control, something ancient, something hungry. Then, the whisper started again, this time clearer, stronger. "Do you know where you are, Emily?" The voice cooed, silky and smooth. Emily struggled against the invisible force that held her in place, her eyes wide, darting around the room. There were no walls, no floors, just an abyss of darkness that stretched endlessly in every direction. She couldn't tell where the doll's voice came from. It was everywhere. The whispers became a chant, low, constant, menacing. Midnight, midnight. The hour of awakening. Her breathing became shallow, panic taking over. She felt as though the very air around her was closing in, pressing down on her chest. It was suffocating. The doll's laughter echoed again, louder this time, like it was mocking her fear. "You thought you could leave?" the voice hissed, and Emily could feel a cold breath brushing against her ear. "You thought you could escape?" Her eyes widened in terror as she looked down at her hands. They were no longer her hands. They were pale, withered, as if aged by centuries of neglect. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, and she felt an unbearable pull, as though something from within was trying to break free. She tried to scream again, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, a thick, black liquid began to seep from her mouth. Her eyes burned with an unnatural fire, and she could hear her heartbeat accelerating, the sound deafening in her ears. The whispers around her grew louder. "Too late, too late. You've crossed the line," the voice purred. "Midnight doesn't just take you, it changes you. It binds you." Suddenly, the ground beneath Emily's feet vanished, and she plunged into an endless spiral. The air grew colder, and a chilling sensation crawled up her spine. Every inch of her body felt like it was being stretched, torn, and twisted. Her limbs felt like they were turning to stone. And then, in a burst of light, Emily's vision snapped back. She was no longer in the empty void. She was back in the shop, but it was different now. The shelves that once held dusty antiques were empty, and the air was thick with an unnatural fog. The doll stood in the center of the room, its eyes glowing red, its mouth stretching into a twisted, cruel smile. Emily tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. She was frozen in place, her limbs heavy as if bound by invisible chains. The doll slowly tilted its head, its eyes narrowing with malicious delight. "You're here now," it said, its voice as cold as the grave. "Forever. I have waited for you." Emily could feel something pulling at her from the inside, a darkness that seemed to wrap around her very soul. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled, trapped within her. The walls around her seemed to close in, the shadows growing longer, darker. And then the clock struck 1. The room seemed to ripple, warping and twisting. The doll's smile grew wider, and Emily could feel herself being drawn toward it. Her feet moved against her will, her body taking steps closer, one after another, until she was standing before the doll, face to face with the porcelain figure. Its red eyes bore into her, and for a moment, she could hear its whisper, "You are the one who will stay." And with that, she felt herself sink into the doll's body. The sensation was indescribable, like drowning in darkness, suffocating as every inch of her being was consumed by the porcelain shell. She tried to fight it, but it was futile. The darkness was all-encompassing, filling her chest, her mind, her very soul. Her vision began to blur, and she could no longer feel her own body. The room around her began to disintegrate, becoming nothing more than a distant memory. And then, just as she thought it would all end, Emily realized she wasn't alone. There were others. Shadows danced at the edge of her vision, figures frozen in time, their eyes wide with fear. They were trapped, just like her, dolls with human souls. Their faces were contorted in agony, their voices muted by the darkness. They had been waiting too, waiting for the next soul to claim. And now, Emily was one of them. She would wait for midnight, just like the doll, and just like the others before her. She would wait for the next curious soul to step inside the shop, drawn to the mystery, to the whispers. She would wait for someone to touch her, to set her free from this torment. But she was wrong to think it was a release. It was just the beginning. If you want more terrifying tales like this one, don't forget to subscribe to Terrifying Tales of America. Who knows what dark forces are waiting in the shadows, waiting for the clock to strike midnight.